Okay, guys, so welcome to today's talk on Evil Women I Have Loved, the Enduring Appeal of Murder Ladies. What we're going to be looking at is not real women who have committed murders. We're not interested, and I'm not valorizing actual evil in the real world. What we're talking about is fictional works, films, TV series, and books. Um, you might recognize some of the pictures here, but just to go through what is being referenced here, we've got Red Sonja. This is Queen Gedren from the film Red Sonja, Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca, Carmilla, Alucarda, and Jennifer from Jennifer's Body. So what we're going to be discussing today, or what we're going to be exploring today, is what the appeal of these murder ladies is for some people, including myself. So I think it's probably worth putting in a quick disclaimer that I am in fact quite biased when it comes to this topic. I love murder ladies in film, in books, on screen, and on stage. There are things that I think are objectively true that you might disagree with. So seeing a large menacing woman that can snap me in half, hot. Seeing a snarling woman covered in the blood of her enemies, also hot. So these are things that for me are true, but we might be coming from different starting points. But what I'm doing today is I'm not going to be offering a reading of these texts to try and tell you that this is the ultimate meaning of them, or this is the underlying meaning of these texts. Instead of that, what I'm going to be doing is thinking about these films, these books, these TV series through the lens of the viewer. There's a sort of autoethnographic focus here because I'm talking about my own relationship with these sapphic murder ladies as it's started in my childhood and goes on to the current day. We'll be thinking about reader responses, and particularly queer reader and watcher responses, and the type of queer reading and counter reading that goes on around these figures, and why they might appeal to us even though they are very directly depicted as evil and dangerous. So just in terms of the approach that I'm going to be using today, I'm going to be thinking about counter reading and queer reading. So one of the things that I think about in relation to this topic is Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's concepts of paranoid and reparative reading in the essay named on the slide there. So in paranoid reading, she describes it as essentially looking at text and trying to find or trying to work out the ways in which they are biased and oppressive, essentially. So looking and finding out this text has a colonial mindset. This text is homophobic. This text is attacking these type of relationships, etc. So we've got that type of reading, and there is a value to that type of reading and trying to see the undercurrents of these texts and how they exclude or marginalize people. But she also says that that can't be the end point of everything. There are other things that we can do with these texts. I find in my own practice that, identifying that a text is racist or homophobic, it's good, but then where do we go after that? What's the next step? And what do we sort of experience after this? What can we take from the text apart from this? How else can we read it once we've discovered that? Or instead of discovering that, sometimes it can be the most obvious point to say that something is homophobic. What else can we see? So reparative reading practices, there isn't one single reparative reading practice, but it involves engaging with the text in a variety of ways. And what I'm going to be thinking about today is the ways in which these texts are counter-read and queerly read by members of the queer community. I'm using myself as an example, so I'm not trying to suggest that everybody reads these texts in the same way. That would be incorrect. But I am saying that there are parts of the community that read them in this way, or that these texts can be important to specific people or specific communities in ways that appear to be in sort of direct contrast to the seeming meaning or intent of the text. So in terms of sort of queer reading, Sedgwick, as sort of summarized by McCann and Monaghan, suggests that queer reading is a process of challenging the dominance of heterosexual representation by making hidden desires visible, making inferred relations overt, and smuggling queerness into texts that were previously thought to deny it. So this is the kind of reading that we're going to be doing with texts from the 19th and early 20th century, where the queerness of the text is either hidden or overtly rejected. We're also going to be engaging in counter reading, which is the practice of reading a text against its seeming point. And I'm going to give you an example of how that works in relation to a 19th century text, Carmilla. But basically, what we're going to be doing today is making everything just a little bit gayer. So I'm going to use Carmilla as a great example of queer counter-reading, because this is a text written in the 19th century which features an evil lesbian vampire who is eradicated from the text violently by a sort of posse of representatives of patriarchal heteronormativity. And the original text depicts her very clearly as a villain, and the relationships that she has with Laura, who she seduces and is intending to kill, is depicted as predatory. But the afterlives of Carmilla often tell a very different story. When I teach this book or read it in book groups, a response that quite frequently occurs is that people are surprised at how homophobic it is, because of the way in which it's been taken in by popular culture, that has become this sapphic classic. But this sort of sapphic classic status is partly a counter reading. We'll think about how the text leaves itself open to that counter reading in a moment. But if we look at the original text, what we see is an idea of Carmilla as a monster, a predatory sapphic character who preys on young women. And she preys on different women in different ways, depending on their class. She kills lower class women indiscriminately and immediately, but she savors higher class women by seducing and then killing them. As a figure in the text, she represents a gender-defying transgressive mode of womanhood. She is gender-defying in the way that she behaves. Laura often compares her to a man or a sort of courting boy. And she also, of course, is engaged in sort of sapphic passions. But she also represents a kind of model of womanhood which stands outside or rejects the kind of Victorian construction of womanhood, the angel in the house, if you will. She is depicted as a fiend, and in the text, she is seen as being fairly punished. So at the end of the novel, she is killed within her coffin. So if you haven't read it, the basic story is Carmilla turning up, seducing Laura. You know, it's quite plain in the text, but it keeps a sort of plausible deniability going on about whether this is actually a sapphic relationship. But at the end, she's discovered and she is killed. So the book depicts her as a monster, and we can understand this sort of underlying construction of queerness and sapphicness that's going on by looking at the theology of the text, and more broadly, vampiric theology. So the vampire comes into English literature in the 18th century through a kind of variety of real reports that are read and passed on. So in terms of how the vampire is understood, it is understood theologically, I would argue. A number of different texts feature or talk about the idea of vampirism as a result of excommunication. So these are real texts. So Paul Ricoeur's account, for example, and in 1823, showing the longevity of the importance of this idea, we have this report that excommunication, the idea that vampirism is caused when somebody is excommunicated and buried outside of the church, and therefore they can't seek their eternal rest. This is recorded in 1823 as the real source of vampire superstition. Of course, it's not the only way in which the vampire is understood. Vampirism is often depicted as a punishment connected with the unconfessed, the condemned, the self-murdering, as it was phrased at the time, and the outcast. We also see often vampirism as the offspring of religious othering, that it's the cause of some other religion that is creating, or somebody from another religion that is passing on this type of infection. But the basic sort of form in which vampirism is understood is as a form of embodied damnation, i.e. entrapment in a corrupted flesh. So to understand the theology of that in very broad terms, we can go back to this idea of the distinction between the flesh and the spirit, which isn't the same as the body and the soul, but it overlaps with it. So the flesh is the old corrupted part of ourselves, infected by Adam's original sin. And we need to be rid of this flesh, which ultimately infects everybody, like the literal bodies of everybody, infects them. So we need to die a natural death in order to be spiritually free. So if we don't die, or if that infected body doesn't die, we are in a form of eternal death because we never reach spiritual life. So this is the idea of the kind of eternal death that vampirism represents. And this overlaps with theologies of queerness in the time as well. So the example that I always use, apologies to those of you who've been in my talk before, is the way in which sexuality and queerness is depicted in Anania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences, a quasi-medical tract which delves into the theology of what it views as transgressive sex. So it's worth noting that although this is about Anania, or onanism, i.e. masturbation, there is within the text frequent conflation of different forms of transgressive sexuality, including queerness. It defines sex in very narrow terms as the carnal commerce of the two sexes for the continuance of the species, and everything outside of that is seen as being part of this sort of world of sin, if you will. But the way in which queer people are understood through this is this idea of uncleanness and infection and being trapped in a body, being trapped in the flesh. So they give themselves over to uncleanness because the spirit cannot dwell with pollution, i.e., there is a victory of the flesh, which, as you can see, would quite easily map onto the vampire. And in a lot of early vampire works, such as John Stagg's 1810 poem, The Vampire, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Christabel, and of course, Carmilla, we see this idea repeated, where the vampiric infected body is synonymous with a queer body. We have this idea as well of infectious damnation, that these queer communities infect themselves with their queerness, essentially, or in the case of the vampire, with their vampirism. Unable to propagate naturally, in inverted commas, the queer subject infects new subjects, spreading a moral and spiritual infection. And so they become depicted as dead people walking. So if you can see quite easily, I think, how queerness and vampirism overlap in their characteristics, which is why we see so many early queer versions of the vampire. And we get in Carmilla vampirism as queerness, as monstrosity. So as Gina Whisker notes, historically, lesbian horror has represented the abject, the censored, and the sexually exciting, with their sexual deviancy figured as vampirism, and their vampirism an excuse for and a projection of what is considered deviant. In my own work, I've talked about the theological aspects of this in texts like Christabel and the Vampire from the Romantic period and Carmilla from the later period. We replay this theology of the queer in the body of vampiric protagonists. There's a narrative of infectious sin, a gradual physical decline, which is also depicted in Anania, a conversion into the radically other, and an inability to resist in a flesh abandoned by the spirit. While the modern iteration of the vampire frequently rejoices in sexual and gender fluidity, the Gothic of the early 19th and late 19th century produced queer sexuality as a form of theologically condemned living death, literally dead men walking, or dead women walking in our case today. So we can see how this sort of theology of queerness overlapping with the vampire appears in Carmilla, where she talks about love and death as essentially synonymous terms. Now, death can be understood here as literal death, but also in that metaphorical sense of spiritual death, the idea that queer love is fatal. And this is something that I recognize as somebody who spent quite a long time within the Christian church, where my own understanding of my own queerness was something which I understood in very similar terms, that it was a sort of death that I could infect people with, that my love would kill people, which is thankfully not anything I believe now. But so some examples from Carmilla. Her soft cheek was glowing against mine. Darling, darling, she murmured, I live in you and you would die for me. I love you so. So here we see love and death becoming synonymous. We get more detail in the second quote, and I've put the second part of the second quote in a separate bullet point because I want to make a separate point with it. But she used to place her pretty arms about my neck, draw me to her, and laying her cheek to mine, murmur with her lips near my ear, dearest, your little heart is wounded. Think me not cruel because I obey the irresistible law of my strength and weakness. If your dear heart is wounded, my wild heart bleeds with yours. In the rapture of my enormous humiliation, I live in your warm life, and you shall die, die, sweetly die, into mine. I cannot help it. As I draw near to you, you in your turn will draw near to others and learn the rapture of that cruelty which yet is love. So for a while, seek to know no more of me and mine, but trust me with all your loving spirit. So we see this idea here of this love and death, again, being bound together as an irresistible law. It's something that Carmilla seems to not be invested in doing, but rather trapped within to a certain extent. We also see this idea that Laura will become like her. So the quote that I drew out at the bottom, that this is inevitable, that this infection will pass from me to you to other people as well. It's also interesting, this idea of love itself, not only as a form of death, but as a form of cruelty. So we can see how the text reflects these queer theological subtexts, or theological subtexts of the queer, if you will, and depict queerness and vampirism as a form of monstrosity. But we can also read the text queerly, so we can start to give a counter reading of the text. George Haggerty in Queer Gothic notes that Gothic fiction can be read as reinscribing the status quo. The fact that Carmilla is brutally slaughtered at the end of the text, for example, seems to eradicate this queerness and all the challenges that she poses to a heteropatriarchal order, seems to just get rid of them. But Gothic resolutions repeatedly insist on order restored and often on the reassertion of the heteronormative prerogative. But at the same time, a non-theological reading, a queer reading, can begin to show the ways in which the Gothic works beyond the limits of its structure and meaning. So to produce new meanings. So what we see here is arguing for not a non-teleological reading, i.e. not reading the whole book through the ending, but finding the spaces in the text where queerness and desire is explored and looking at how it's explored. So as Whisker notes, there is a constant tension in the book, actually, between punishment and celebration of the transgressive nature. And the exciting threat offered by female vampires in texts like Carmilla is terrifying and punished, but it also lingers and can be reread as a disturbing potential. And this is the way in which I think many people have read Carmilla and why it's become a sapphic classic and why it's been so often reinterpreted as about two lesbians, including in the Carmilla web series, for example, which has a happy ending. But so let's look at the queerness in the text and what we might identify with, or why we might love this particular evil woman, or why people have sort of latched on to Laura and Carmilla and rewritten and reimagined them so many times. Well, if we look at what's depicted in the text, not ignoring the ending, but putting it to one side, we start to see that what we're getting is a seduction, but also somebody's navigation of queer attraction in a world which is essentially homophobic and misogynistic. So Laura's response mingles repulsion and attraction, echoing a sense of sexual confusion and internalized homophobia. So the following quote, for example, a strange tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable ever and anon mingled with a vague sense of fear and disgust. I was conscious of a love growing into adoration and also of abhorrence. So the balance of these two things is central to Laura's experience. And it's also central, I would say, to why the text draws people in. This isn't simply depicted as a one-sided seduction, but it's depicted as this navigation of queer desire. Although the queer desires of Carmilla are seemingly rejected by the text or condemned, there is a sort of sense of pity for her, if you will, or feeling for her. So we're told that it will never desist, i.e. the vampire will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will in these cases husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. So it's depicted, the seduction that we see of Laura is here being dismissed, and depicted as sort of a game or a trick, except that last line, where we can read the it seems to in two different ways, i.e. it seems to yearn, but it doesn't, or we can say it seems to yearn, so maybe does it? So we can read it with that sense of ambiguity and doubt. This idea that Carmilla is somebody who does yearn, for whom we can have sympathy, somebody trapped within her own vampirism, for example. Most famously, of course, Carmilla is not fully eradicated from the text because Laura continues to remember her, and her impact on Laura's life continues beyond the text. Laura, for example, never gets married. She never moves beyond this awakening of queer attraction. To this hour, the image of Carmilla returns to memory in ambiguous alteration, sometimes in the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes in the writhing fiend I saw in the ruined church, and often from a reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing room door. In other words, that pull towards both attraction and repulsion, that mix of confusion, internalized homophobia, and desire continues beyond Carmilla's death within the text. So we've seen here how we can give a counter reading of a text and how a character like Carmilla might become important to Sapphic people or Sapphic communities. So I want to give an example from the 20th century of someone taking the Carmilla story to some extent and reimagining it through a slightly different lens, although we still have very much a murder lady who gets punished by the text at the end of it. So Alucarda, for those of you who don't know, is a Mexican film from 1977, which was filmed in English. It is available on YouTube, so you can go and look it up. And it's the story of Alucarda, who was born to, we think, maybe Lucy Westenra. If you watch it, you'll see why I'm confused about some of the details of it, because it's a little bit like a fever dream. But it seems that maybe she's the daughter of Dracula and Lucy Westenra or something like that. We don't really know. But she is brought up in a convent. Then when she's a teenager, the age that we can see on screen, she meets Justine. So Justine's parents have died, and she also has to move to this convent. They begin a friendship that becomes a sort of love affair. And there's a lot of quotation from Carmilla, so it's directly in reference to that, although it's also clearly directly in reference to other vampiric texts like Dracula as well. Ultimately, what happens is that they get sort of separated from each other. So You can see here the church that they are brought into, or the convent that they're brought into, and it's depicted very overtly. And I mean, the aesthetics of this are gorgeous, but it's depicted very overtly as an oppressive, religious, patriarchal, and heteronormative institution. We can see the massive amount of Jesuses there in the background, hanging up all on the cross. We can also see the nuns themselves, who are dressed almost like they're wrapped in grave clothes, this kind of living death, this place of confinement. The convent itself often resembles more of like an underground cavern system, so famous from the early Gothic works, these places of entrapment and fear for women. So Justine and Alucarda meet and they fall in love, seemingly. And eventually, though, Justine falls ill. So there are two potential reasons for this, and it's not very clear in the film what the reason is. But they visit a tomb that kind of opens and they both scream, although I'm not sure why, because there's nothing particularly frightening about it, but they do. So there's the potential that that is what makes Justine ill. But Alucarda blames something else. She blames the hellfire sermon from the priest that you can see being delivered here. And she blames that and the nuns' restrictive practices for Justine's illness, saying to them very directly, monsters, they have done this to you. So saying to Justine. In the sort of wake of Justine's illness, Alucarda turns her back on the church and she calls out saying that God can't help me, and instead she calls to various satanic powers, leading ultimately to her invoking Satan and both girls making a demonic pact. But they react differently to it. So they're both brought and demand sort of to repent. Justine starts to do so, and her repentance seems to make her sicker. Whereas Alucarda has never repented of anything in her life and continues to defy everyone. Ultimately, Justine dies in what appears to be a sort of failed exorcism, and this drives Alucarda to the point of madness. But the villain in this is not the vampiric figure. Justine becomes a vampire, and it's not the kind of clearly the murdery woman, Alucarda. Instead, it becomes the society in which they live, and particularly the kind of religious vault in which they are placed, if you will, or the religious society, which is restricting them and trying to part their friendship. So she goes to confession, or she's forced to go to confession. And instead of confessing, she says, I love life with Justine. You call yourself blessed, but you worship death. I love Justine. You love to kill. We are not to be blamed. You are. And so it changes the narrative about who's to blame. And so the Alucarda then basically loses it and she attacks everybody. She gets these demonic powers. She sets fire to the church and to the nuns, and she gets her revenge. So there we go. Sorry, let me just go backwards. So as you can see, she sets fire to the nuns with her mind. And then she sets fire to the whole building. The last lingering shot of the film is of one of the statues of Jesus burning away. However, we don't get a sort of final happy ending for Alucarda. She ultimately loses the battle. One of the nuns, a dead nun, the only good nun, is brought in and held up in the position of Christ on the cross. And although she tries to burn that nun with her mind, the nun's kind of dead holiness seems to stop her. So she ends up dying, just as Justine has earlier been killed with holy water as a vampire. But what I think is really interesting and delightful about this text, what appeals about it, is what Alucarda gets to express within it. Now, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that by loving these murder ladies or talking about their appeal, we're not suggesting that what we want to see people do in real life is burn down churches and murder people with their mind. Absolutely not. We're reading these actions more symbolically for what they express and what they allow us to express. So although it's not particularly clear in this picture, Alucarda is driven not only by rage, but also by pain. And she, in this scene, she spins around screaming, this kind of mix of pain and rage, all of which are being expressed. So the appeal of the depiction of female rage is perhaps more obvious. All of the angers and all of the things that have to be lived with in a misogynistic society and in a sort of lesbophobic society are raged against. But not only raged against, she gets her vengeance. She burns it all down. But for me, I think what really appeals to me is this depiction of her pain as well. So we haven't really thought about the context in which these were written or filmed. But in both the 19th and the 20th century, for many people, either homosexuality was outlawed or frowned upon. And so we have all of these sort of experiences of queerness which had to happen in private and secretly. And one of those is things like pain and grief. But what Alucarda does to an extreme degree is express this pain, is scream about it and demand that the world sees it. So for me, I think the appeal of Alucarda is the fact that she offers a form of fictional catharsis for the reader or the viewer, that her experience and depiction of pain and rage is freeing for the reader or viewer. So I've had a look at some kind of traditional text there. Well, Carmilla is a traditional text, and we've looked at Alucarda as a reimagining of a sort of some of the underlying themes of sapphic vampirism. But now I want to go back in a different way. So not historically, but go back in my own story. So Red Sonja is a film that I have been obsessed with since I was a tiny child. It came out 1 year after I was born, I think, in 1985. And I always loved it. And I continue to love it, and I continue to make people watch it. And I've always loved specifically Queen Gedren, played by Sandal Bergman. So I'm talking about Red Sonja here in this autoethnographic spirit, going back to the beginning for me. And can I answer the question of the chicken and the egg? Not really. I don't know if I love murder ladies because I love this character so much, or I love this character because I love murder ladies so much. It's a bit of a toss-up. But one of the reasons that this character appealed to me particularly was because I already knew this actress from a previous sword and sorcery movie, i.e. Conan the Barbarian. So in Conan the Barbarian, she plays the warrior and thief Valeria. And as you can see in this picture, she is incredibly competent. She's smarter and a better fighter than the people that she's around. And she does ultimately die, unfortunately, for Conan the Barbarian, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is fairly sad for me. But I was already sort of really interested in this actress. And then she played Queen Gedren, and I loved Queen Gedren. Queen Gedren is a on-stage depicted evil, explicitly lesbian queen. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about why the character appeals to me so much is because although in Conan the Barbarian, Sandal Bergman had played Arnold Schwarzenegger's love interest, when it came to Red Sonja, she rejected that role and chose instead to be the evil queen. So there's something kind of metatextual as well going on here for me about the way in which the film and the actress rejects the role of love interest here. So in terms of what's so appealing about Gedren, I also think a contrast between Queen Gedren and Red Sonja herself is illuminating. So both of these are passionate warrior women, great with swords and independent to a certain degree. But where Queen Gedren gets to be an evil lesbian queen, ruling her kingdom and everyone around her, Red Sonja is somebody who, fights for what is right, apparently, and her prize for this at the end is a romantic relationship with the Arnold Schwarzenegger character. There is an attempt to focus on equality here. She says, I will never sleep with anybody that can't beat me in a fair fight. And so they kind of fight and fight and fight, and neither of them ever wins because they are completely equally matched, is the idea. And so there is this kind of attempt to reproduce equality. But what I love about the Queen Gedren character is that she is never defined in relationship to a man. And it always feels to me like a really sad prize for Red Sonja that she just gets Arnold Schwarzenegger. No offense to Arnold Schwarzenegger if he ever watches this video, but. I think the sort of elephant in the room when talking about Queen Gedren is how she is introduced into the film. So I'm not sure about this, but when I was younger, I think they missed out some of the first few minutes on the sort of pre-Watershed TV film like showings, because at the beginning of the film, she's introduced as desiring carnally Red Sonja. And when Red Sonja says no, she orders for her family to be killed, her house to be burnt, and for Red Sonja herself to be raped. So when I was sort of obsessed with Queen Gedren growing up, as I continue to be, if we're honest, it was without this first part. And I think it's an interesting kind of watching practice to try and ignore or remove parts of the character that are uncomfortable. I also think what we see in this first opening part is the most lesbophobic aspect of the whole film, where we have this idea of sapphic sexuality as predatory, violent, and monstrous. The rest of the film takes a very different perspective, and it's that I'm particularly drawn to or more interested in. So, what is so appealing about this monstrous murder lady in the rest of the film? Well, I mean, I think the picture speaks for itself, guys. She's got her little girlfriend here who is in quite a strange relationship with her. She's also got her cool Gothic castle going on with her little skeletons. And also, just off screen, you can't quite see him, she has a massive pet spider as well. So, I mean, this was goals for me as a small child. There was something deeply attractive about this over the top, very camp, really kind of Gothic queen. But what was more interesting is the depiction of desire, not just sapphic desire. The whole film is about Gedren taking the talisman. She kills a whole monastery or a whole convent of warrior nuns to do so. Red Sonja is the heroic character whose sister was one of those nuns, and she takes sort of her sister's dying words and she goes off to try and save the world and get the talisman back. All the while, Queen Gedren is using it to destroy people and she is feeding it with light to get more and more power. At the end, Red Sonja wins, but there's something particularly interesting to me about what Queen Gedren is doing or her desires. So in this scene, or in a previous scene with the same characters, we have Eichel here with his amazing hat and Queen Gedren talking about the talisman. He's saying it's too dangerous to keep giving it so much light. It's getting too powerful. Saying, God Majesty, what do you want? Our vaults are brimming with gold. What more is there? To which she replies, the world, Eichel. Today we took another piece of it, the city of Toctil, but I have wider claims, and the talisman will enforce them. To which he replies, madness, there will be no world. But what I think was appealing to me as a child is about this undisguised desire for the world to give you what it owes you, in her opinion, or what you want from it. So she lives outside the boundaries of what people tell her life should be. She lives outside the hierarchies of gender and sex, and she lives outside of a kind of heteronormative structure as well. And it was this sort of unabashed desire that was so intriguing to me about this character, and also, you know, the goth look, and the excellent sword play. So another important text for me is Rebecca. So I'm going to be thinking here about the film and the book. The book to me is more interesting than the film, but we can't deny that the film's depiction of Mrs. Danvers, as seen here, creates a kind of much more sapphic outlook, or it leans into the sapphism of the character. So for those of you who haven't read Rebecca, just in case, it's very kind of, it's structured as a kind of response in many ways to Jane Eyre. We have a second wife who remains unnamed throughout the text, who marries Maxime de Winter, goes back to his house, and she feels kind of haunted by the non-literal presence of Rebecca, his first wife, who she thinks, you know, is so amazing and he must have loved her so much. All of this is backed up by Mrs. Danvers herself, who is the housekeeper, who is seemingly in love with Rebecca and is always kind of needling the new wife and talking Rebecca up. At the end of the text, we find out, spoiler alert, that Maxime has killed his wife, well, in the book at least, and Mrs. Danvers ends it by taking her revenge. So in the film, it's slightly different than in the book, or quite importantly different. So she brings down the house in a very similar way to what we find in Jane Eyre. So in Jane Eyre, the house is brought down. It's a symbol of Rochester's patriarchal power. It's a symbol of his wealth, and everything that means equality between him and Jane cannot happen. And so we see a very similar destruction of the house going on here. But in the film, there are some key differences to the book, and it's less celebrated in the film than seen as an act of willful destruction that is attacking the happy couple. So one of the main differences is that in the book, Maxime and his wife have gone down to London to find out essentially what happened to Rebecca. In the film, he finds out that she killed herself, and so he gets let off the hook. But his wife in the film stays at home. He goes to London. And so we see then Mrs. Danvers kind of stalking through the house with one lit candle, glowering over the figure of the new wife. She then sets fire to the house, and we're told later by the new wife why she'd done it. It's Mrs. Danvers, she's gone mad. She said she'd rather destroy Manderley than see us happy here. So within this version of it, Maxime becomes less guilty. He's not a murderer. The new wife is seen quite positively within the film, and we're sort of Mrs. Danvers is depicted as kind of jealously trying to destroy their love. And in the end, she is ultimately punished for it. We can see a picture of her here within the house as the flames go up and she seems to die in the fire. In the book, though, I think we find something more interesting, although I do love the stage depiction, the film depiction of Mrs. Danvers as well. So instead of simply bringing down the house, I think what's particularly interesting is that she escapes the house. So this is a long quotation, which I won't read all of it because it goes into quite a lot of detail about basically Mrs. Danvers, we find out before the end, has cleared out. It goes into how she has been searched for, but ultimately we decide she's gone, she's disappeared. They looked for her and could not find her. They think she's gone. She must have gone straight out of the house and through the woods. She never passed the lodge gates. So at the end of the film, Mrs. Danvers has disappeared. Maxime and his wife both go to London, and when they come back, they find the house burning. It's blamed on Mrs. Danvers, but I think what is particularly interesting here is how she isn't punished by this. Instead, she finally manages to escape the house and everything that it represents, and it is burnt down. But instead of what we get in the film, where it's depicted as an attempt to thwart their love, in the book, it's much more complicated. So throughout the film, Mrs. Danvers has been the only person who still cared about Rebecca, really. The one who venerates her, the one who remembers her. Maxime dismisses her as somebody who was promiscuous and essentially worthy of death for what he did to her. And his bride is equally blasé about her death. She's worried that he loves Rebecca too much. And so when she finds out that he doesn't love Rebecca at all and that he killed Rebecca, she is really glad about it. She's really happy that a kind of heteropatriarchal order has been restored and that they can live together in this very restricted way. But Mrs. Danvers is not having it. She is not having Rebecca erased, and she's not having Rebecca turned into a cartoon villain. At the end, she burns down the house, not simply as a symbol of, oh, they love each other and I'm mad about it. Rather, it becomes a symbol of his wealth, of his status, but also of the heteropatriarchal and heteronormative structure that has brought Rebecca down, and to which Mrs. Danvers doesn't ever really belong. So it's an act of vengeance, which she escapes, which I also love, that she's one of the few murder ladies to make it out in these early texts. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about a couple of modern examples. There's lots and lots of really interesting books with murdery women out there in the horror and Gothic spheres. But I'm still going to be looking at ones at the moment which eradicate these women from the text. So we're still thinking about sort of counter reading and reading between the lines. So I want to briefly talk about the film Jennifer's Body. We have two friends, Jennifer and Needy, who are sort of romantically into each other as well, I would argue. And they go to a concert and Jennifer is killed by the band. She's sacrificed to Satan, essentially, but because she's not a virgin, she comes back sort of possessed and evil and then goes on a rampage of destruction, killing mostly men, including attempting to attack Needy's boyfriend. Ultimately, she is killed by Needy, who goes on then, after she escapes an asylum, to kill the band that had originally killed Jennifer. One of the sort of reactions to Jennifer's Body at the time was a kind of dismissal of the film, and it's been reevaluated later. But one of the things that we still sometimes see is the accusation that this film is essentially queer baiting, that it wants to give us a bit of titillation with Jennifer and Needy, but then Jennifer ends up usually having more overtly physical relationships with men. However, as Carmen Maria Machado has noted in her essay Both Ways from the It Came from the Closet Queer Reflections on Horror book, which I cannot recommend enough, Jennifer and Needy are throughout the text intimately involved with each other. She says that Jennifer and Needy experience so many kinds of intimacy, it's amazing we've retconned it into a kiss and a catchphrase. As children, they're in love and already unequal. Needy brings her mouth to a cut on Jennifer's hand. Jennifer tells her not to tell. They exchange long and devoted looks towards each other that a classmate calls them lesbigay. Needy knows when Jennifer is near, even before the film turns supernatural. And a ravenous, freshly turned Jennifer nearly bites Needy, though she resists. They eventually kiss long and hard and sensuously on Needy's bed before Needy bounces up, shrieking, "What the fuck are we doing?" Jennifer assures Needy she won't bite and delivers silly, porny dialogue about sharing a bed during sleepovers and how they used to play boyfriend-girlfriend in the past. When Needy eventually kills Jennifer, she does it facing her, straddling her. This is how Jennifer's mother finds them, compromised in Jennifer's canopy bed. Just before this, Jennifer breaks her promise and bites Needy in the shoulder, leaving a mark that transfers some of her powers to Needy permanently. So I read the whole quote because I think, I can't do better than Carmilla Machado in analyzing the desire and intimacy that is found in this text. But what we get, I think, particularly interestingly here, is a depiction of the navigation of bisexual desire for both characters. And it's depicted as being, not easy, not with tidy edges. The experience that most people have of bisexual, of trying to, going through bisexual within a homophobic or biphobic society, of navigating their feelings and emotions in relation to the people that they are attracted to. Everything, of course, is disrupted by Jennifer's death, and so it gets even more messy. So we have Jennifer becoming both victim and monster in this scenario and taking out her monstrosity and her rage mostly against men. But what the film navigates throughout is a messy space of desire, vengeance, jealousy between both of them, the relationship between them being depicted as a form of safety, but also the monstrosity, not only of Jennifer, but Needy's gained monstrosity, or how she's seen as monstrous, but ultimately setting Jennifer free. So it's an interesting text which explores this messy space and forms of bisexual desire. Another one that I want to mention is Crimson Peak, and particularly the character of Lucille. So I've always thought that Lucille gave me sapphic vibes, and thankfully to Sarah, thank you, directed me towards Jessica Chastain talking about the character and saying, most people don't know this. This is in an interview with The Guardian. Guillermo doesn't even know this, but I played it that her fantasies are more about women than men. Her character, Lucille, slowly poisons the women who marry her brother and cares for them as they die, ostensibly so she can keep him to herself and spend their money. Chastain describes the intimacy of that murderous act of holding someone's hand as they die. It's a very sexual thing to do. And so I've chosen this particular picture because I think there's an interesting example of a triangular relationship in terms of the framing. And it's exactly this moment of sort of holding somebody's hand or catering to them in the moment of death, where Mia Wasikowska, interestingly, looks kind of in this moment of tortured ecstasy. And we know that Lucille and Thomas Sharp are in an incestuous relationship with each other. But Thomas Sharp also falls in love with his wife number 5 or whatever it is, who officially he's married in order to get her money and murder her, but he falls in love with her. The interesting question is about what Lucille feels towards her, but there is, I think, a navigation of intimacy and desire. The appeal of this character is multiplicitous. I mean, just objectively, guys, I would say there is something incredibly hot about Jessica Chastain wandering around in this blood-soaked gown and angrily wandering through the house. But of course, she is monstrous. But I think there are ways to read her that see the humanity in her as well. So a lot of kind of criticism of the film is about her monstrous relationship with Thomas Sharp. As the older sibling, it's viewed as kind of her control over him. And I'm not going to contest that reading, but rather just offer a parallel one. I think what appeals to us about her is her pursuit of desire, once again. The desire for the life that she wants, free from her abusive parents and with the brother that she loves in whatever way, and trying to sort of fulfill his dreams and maintain the house, something that she does incredibly competently and with a great deal of style. She's also a consummate survivor. So she survives the various vicissitudes of this text, apart from the last one, being abandoned. The love that she describes is a monstrous love. And I think there's something particularly appealing in that. So she talks about the things we do for a love like this are ugly, mad, full of sweat and regret. This love burns you and maims you and twists you inside out. It is a monstrous love, and it makes monsters of us all. This idea of the monstrosity of her love, I think, is an interesting exploration of love which exists in a space of transgression and what that can mean in all of its different ways. I think the most appealing thing, though, about her, or the thing that draws us to her, is the ultimate revelation that she is trapped. She has always been trapped in this house, in this relationship. She survived and she sought for what she desired, but she's always been trapped, and she ends up incredibly trapped. In this picture, we get to see her pain and suffering as well. So what you can't see on screen is in front of her, Thomas Sharp, who she is accidentally murdered, appears to her, and he is clearly on Edith's side. So this is a moment of kind of realization of abandonment, and you can just kind of see Edith in the background about to hit her in the head with a shovel. But also, ultimately, Lucille is trapped in the house. She is a ghost that remains consistently trapped at Crimson Peak, unable to ever escape it and everything that it has meant to her. So, I wanted to end with a slightly more positive note with this question: do murder ladies ever get happy endings? Arguably, Mrs. Danvers perhaps does, but I want to argue for a proper happy ending in some modern texts, such as one of my favorites, Cat Sebastian's Hither Page, and the characters Cora and Edith. This is a murder mystery, so, close your ears if you don't want any spoilers. But we find out that Cora has, throughout her whole life, essentially been a spy, and a very murdery spy at that. And Edith is, I would argue, her enabler. But these, by the time we meet them, are two old ladies who try and make people eat cake enough. And we find that Cora has committed one of the murders in the text, but she has killed the original murderer. So she is an agent of vengeance, even as this sort of sweet little old lady that everybody underestimates. But I think it's a really lovely example of this question of, do murder ladies ever get happy endings? And what happens when they get past their murdering prime? Do they get to just live in a nice little house with their wife and their adopted child? Maybe. There's hope yet, according to Cat Sebastian. So just to kind of round off with these ideas of what is the enduring appeal of murder ladies. Now, I'm not saying it's a universal appeal, but it appeals to a great number of us, I think, or a certain number of us. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not the appeal of actual terrible people in real life. This is the fictional constructs and everything that they can symbolize. I think one of the points of appeal is this idea of we are made monsters. If you are depicted or described as a monster in your real life, then you are drawn to the monsters on stage or on screen or in your books. When I was growing up under Section 28, it wasn't possible to talk about and represent people like me, essentially. And what we got on television and on screen were evil lesbians for the most part. And this kind of, it's again that chicken and the egg thing. Do I like monstrous women because that was what I got? That was the representation that I had. Or did I always love monstrous women? Who can say? But that appeal of that which is made monstrous when you yourself are being depicted as monstrous. All of these murder ladies also live beyond the boundaries of their society or the limits which people try and put upon them. They express rage and they become themselves living nightmares, getting their revenge on the society, offering us a form of fictional catharsis. And also, as we saw with Alucarda and arguably with Lucille as well, we see them expressing the pain that comes with these restricted lives. There's also, I would argue, the inherent appeal of the murder lady, the appeal of competence, of desire, and of demanding what you want from the world. For me, murder ladies read between the lines are aspirational because they are free. And also, as we can see in this picture, it's a delightful image, burning the world down or eating its heart out because of the ways in which it has wronged you or just in defiance of it. It's a great thing to fictionally experience. Ta-da, the end.